because this data is normally released earlier, which is measuring tangibles such as electricity usage or cement production. Cement, of course, a very good indicator of how the construction industry is doing, and construction is a very important employer across the sub-region. Now there, if we look at Kenya, the largest economy again in the region, you see actually you don't see much signs of a major impact. There was a dip in the initial months of the crisis in March, April, May, but subsequently you see that it was a very fast recovery, and actually they continued with some of their major infrastructure projects, which is a kind of Keynesian response to a crisis, you know, when you continue to fund those large projects and make sure that they're not disrupted by a pandemic or economic crisis of this nature. DRC, we also have numbers for their cement production, and the story is rather different. Now, the level of construction is rather different from Kenya, but you can see that there was a very serious dip actually in the initial months of the crisis, which has not subsequently been recovered. Electricity, we see a similar pattern actually in terms of a very fast recovery in the terms of Kenyan economy. And electricity consumption maps follows quite closely GDP data as well. So that's quite evident there. Again, signs of more problems in DRC in terms of how it's impacted. You can compare the structures of the two economies, really quite different. The Kenyan economy being a much more diversified economy, DRC being much more dependent on minerals, of course, the mineral sector and commodity sector. And a third example here, Uganda has a composite index of economic activity, which is measuring business sentiment across a number of sectors. There you can see that took a very sharp hit during the first wave, recovered strongly, and then there were more concerns during the second wave. So again, there are concerns about the vigor of the economic recovery in the sub-region. Tourism, I don't need to tell you, of course, that tourism numbers practically went to zero as the crisis hit, and was particularly keenly felt by those economies most dependent on tourism revenues. Rwanda was, of course, hit because of the MICE tourism and the conferences that were cancelled, for example. Seychelles, as you saw, the GDP results were very serious on the back of the complete disappearance of tourists, on which about 60% of the economy is dependent. Now, another question which I think is important to ask us is the impact on prices of this crisis. And here I'm going to show you some mixed evidence on the prices. Firstly, has the crisis been inflationary? Now, amongst economists, generally speaking, there's a divergence of opinion on this. One study, which was recently published, Daly and Chankoff, looked at prior pandemics historically to see whether they had been inflationary, and found that actually they weren't. They tended to be deflationary. It takes a lot of effective demand out of the economic system. It certainly disrupts supply chains. There are some cost push factors which could lead to higher inflation, but effective demand suffers quite a lot during a pandemic. People end up not being able to spend a lot of their savings. So that's one dimension. There are other economists, however, warning alarms about the way, certainly in high-income countries, how they've dealt with this crisis by large-scale injections of monetary easing, for example, quantitative easing further to help support the economy, and the fiscal measures that have been undertaken to support businesses. A lot of economists are now worrying that there will be a spike in global inflation over the next couple of years because of the levels of debt that have come from this crisis. Now, in our sub-region, the picture's been mixed. Here in Rwanda, I think in the initial months, there were some concerns that inflation was going quite high, but that subsequently come down, and I'll show you a chart which I think explains partially that trend for Rwanda. Other countries, they've barely felt any increase in prices from the crisis. We have two really quite high inflation countries in the region. Ethiopia, which was already structurally high prior to this crisis hitting, but has remained high, and of course they've had problems such as the conflict in Tigray, as well as the pandemic, which has caused further macroeconomic problems for them. DRC is also experiencing growing inflation. So those are the two economies where inflation is currently highest. An important question to always look at in terms of prices is international prices as well, commodities. When people talk about the African continent, they normally start with a discussion about commodity prices, assuming that high commodity prices are good for Africa and low commodity prices are bad, and assuming also that a pandemic is going to cause a collapse in commodity prices. Neither of those two things were correct in terms of this crisis. Firstly, Eastern Africa is actually, the majority of countries are net commodity importers, not net commodity exporters. We have a few countries which are clearly net commodity exporters, such as DRC, but actually, on balance, countries import more commodities than export. And they have benefited largely through the decline in fuel prices, which came down very, very sharply early on in this crisis. There were other structural reasons for that happening. But if you look at this chart here, you will appreciate that actually there's been a decline in commodity prices during this crisis, but it's been driven by one sector, fuels. In other sectors, you've seen moderate increases in food, in minerals and ores, tropical beverages, vegetables, oil seeds and oils. Precious metals has been particularly high. And that's benefited a number of countries in our sub-region, which have been exporting precious metals. Tanzania, for example, did very well out of its gold exports. So did Eritrea, for example. So the picture on international prices is quite mixed, and its impact on our sub-region has also been mixed. You need to look at the detailed picture of what a country is importing and exporting. That said, when we looked at the inflation data in detail, we did notice that there is some worrying trends in particular subsectors. So, for example, transport, housing, and some food items actually in some countries have been increasing quite significantly during this sector. This is the data here for Uganda first, where you see transport sector clearly impacted by the crisis and heavy price rises. In Rwanda, this was one of the major contributory factors to that spike in CPI in the early months of the crisis. Though government brought in measures, I think, to control that subsequently, and you see it dip down quite sharply afterwards. And Kenya also seen similar rises. On food, of course, for a lot of poor households, this is a crucial matter. Uganda generally doesn't tend to have much food price inflation in the way that other economies may in the region. They tend to be, have lower prices and slightly higher productivity because of more land in terms of agricultural produce. However, in Rwanda, it was quite a serious issue in the first opening months of the crisis as well, with very high food price inflation, which subsequently also, due to some government measures, there was a degree of speculation, it looked like, in some markets, and measures were taken to avoid that. Kenya, more modest price increases in food. One impact of the crisis that we need to bear in mind, of course, is its impact on government revenues. Fiscal revenues have been badly impacted. I believe the estimate for last year for Rwanda was around a 9% contraction initially. I'm not sure what the final figures were, but clearly across the region, countries have been struggling because a lot of their normal sources of income have been impacted by the crisis. This was the situation in 2020, and you can see that quite a number of countries suffered a quite severe deterioration in their fiscal situation and fiscal balances. And as a consequence, debt levels have actually been going up quite markedly in the sub-region. But you can't see the screen because you can see the back of my head at the moment. So, could you please show the graph, please, rather than the back of my head? Thank you. Yes, so here you see that actually debt to GDP ratios beyond 50% are considered of concern for countries in our sub-region. Not so for the high-income countries, which now have very, very high levels, well in excess of 100% of GDP for countries such as the US or the UK, for example, now. Not to speak of countries like Italy and Japan. In our sub-region, generally speaking, debt levels of that level wouldn't be sustainable at all because of lower export revenues and foreign exchange earnings. But you can see there's been a very significant rise, in any case, in debt levels across the sub-region because of this. And for this reason, there's been a lot of emphasis, I think, in terms of negotiations through the IMF and the World Bank. Our organisation has been calling for debt moratorium, for example, for low-income countries. There's an urgent need for extra additional concessionary finance and the increase in the amount of special drawing rights which go to the African continent. It's only a very small share of this large increment in special drawing rights which actually fell to Africa. I believe about 33 billion of the over 600 billion that were agreed. So there's definitely a need for more concessional finance to help governments through this crisis. Now, the next few slides, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, a little bit behind schedule, Seth, but this is my key topic, regional trade. And here the results have been really quite surprising. The degree of resilience in Eastern Africa was not anticipated. When I looked at the Economist Intelligence Unit at the beginning of the crisis, they were forecasting declines of maybe 30–40% for exports for countries like Rwanda, really large declines. And so was the WTO globally. Subsequently, people saw that global trade rebounded much quicker than anticipated. And in our sub-region, the story has really been quite remarkable. But you can't see it because you can only see me again. Sorry. Yeah, here you see of exports, 9 countries out of 14 in the sub-region actually experienced rise in exports compared to 2019 in 2020, which is really quite remarkable, isn't it, given the scale of the global pandemic, that actually countries managed to expand their exports. On the import side, you see that imports went down and approximately half the countries maintained themselves more or less the same for the others. And as a result of this, for a lot of countries in the sub-region, you find that trade balances for merchandise trade has improved. That story is not true, of course, if we incorporate services. I'll come to that in a second. However, we should be concerned about the initial decline in imports, because if it's of consumer goods, then it may not have long-term developmental impacts. But if it's been in capital goods or intermediate goods, then it causes problems for industry and businesses in the region. So there is that dimension too. Let's have a quick look at Kenya. This is the performance of Kenya in terms of the accumulated trade in 2019. And you can see what the relative performance was in 2020. By the end of the year, Kenya was exporting more. It had a dip during the time of the initial crisis, but quickly recovered its levels of trade. And I think particularly interesting for the sub-region is to look at the re-exports of Kenya, because those re-exports are the goods that come in through Mombasa port and then are sent to the rest of the sub-region. And the re-export figures show a very sharp spike, actually just anticipating the crisis. Traders realized that there was a global problem and were doing a lot of orders. So suddenly there was a huge spike, and then suddenly it dropped back down again. But if you look at the total for re-exports, it did very well, which suggests that those regional transport corridors weren't so heavily impacted. There was initial disruption, but measures taken by the EAC and others were quickly resolved the problems. Okay, a few final comments on trade, and I'll start to wrap up the presentation, get to some social dimensions as well. Firstly, although there is positive side of merchandise trade, informal sector trade, cross-border trade was badly impacted. As you're aware, for example, the frontier between Rubavu and Goma, for example, before, of course, this terrible volcanic eruption, was a lot of informal trade carrying on. I think 80,000 people passing the DRC random border every single day. That stopped across the region, you know, because of the prohibitions on travel amongst countries. The challenges tended to be more serious also for the landlocked countries. We see that the trade performance was more resilient for Tanzania and Kenya, for example, than it was relatively for the landlocked countries. They had more problems in terms of disruption to transport corridors. And there's also evidence that although the aggregate numbers of merchandise trade maintained relatively high, in fact, what we see is a change in the composition, and the diversified exports suffered. The Kenyan textile industry, for example, took a hit initially, whereas what we see increasing was the mineral exports because of those global prices, yeah, and we see that across the region, actually, mineral exports increasing in composition. So it's not the direction of travel the region wants to go. And finally, services were hit particularly hard. Services, for example, Tanzania, the tourism income drying up. This is what this reflects. You know, they actually had a positive services balance because of tourism and transport services, but that dried up during the time of the crisis. So very quickly onto some social impact. I think you're probably well aware of the tolls here in terms of number of cases of COVID and the number of deaths. Eastern Africa has escaped relatively lightly because we have a large share of the population of the continent, but the number of deaths is actually significantly below the continental average. That's partially attributed to containment measures early on. Swift response also reflects the fact that the region's no stranger to these kind of pandemics. Ebola, for example, gave plenty of practice to health authorities on how to control highly contagious diseases. One thing it has done, the crisis, it's highlighted weaknesses in regional health systems. And that reflects simply low levels of per capita income translating into low levels of public expenditure in health. So these are the figures there. The African average is only $114 per capita per year on health expenditures. Now that compares like somewhere like the US, where it would be about $10,000 per person per capita. Okay, so there's this massive divide in terms of the capacity to spend on health systems. And our region is particularly notable as an outlier in terms of the low level of health expenditures per capita. The average for Eastern Africa we computed was less than $50 a year. Also reflected in terms of the number of doctors and hospital beds, which is also very low in the sub-region compared to African continental averages as well as global averages. This is another theme that we wish to highlight in our report as well, the negative impact of COVID on treatment of other diseases as well. So communicable diseases tend to be the leading cause of deaths in Eastern Africa. For example, perinatal and nutritional conditions account for more than half the deaths every single year in the sub-region. And the concern was, of course, with lockdown, that people were not attending health centres in the way that they had previously. This is a global problem, of course, but particularly acute, I think, in Eastern Africa. WHO has calculated that there could be extra 400,000 excess deaths, AIDS-related deaths, which we could go back to the level of 2008 because people are not getting their retroviral medicines in the way that they should have been, for example. So there's been some global disruptions. Similarly, WHO's estimating a 50% disruption in access to anti-malarials could lead into another 100,000 deaths across the continent. This needs to be factored in when we discuss the impact of the pandemic, yeah, and how it's disrupted health provision. Schools, the long-term impacts of the crisis, we see that school closures have affected 96 million learners in Eastern Africa, 79% who are primary school and younger. Those early years are key years for children in terms of their development, growth and development. And so there can be long-term consequences from this as well. Need for digitalization, you see there on the slide. I think it's wakened everybody up about the potential of digitalization, but also the economic cost to it when you don't have sufficient access to internet, for example. Yeah? So this is another side to the crisis. So the conclusions and the recommendations, Seth, you'll be very pleased to hear, are none at all. I did hear the PS, Michel Sibera, talking about policy recommendations coming from this. I actually feel quite strongly, if you have a policy idea strongly coming from your research, then you need to highlight it and make sure the message is clear. But sometimes it's just important to understand the reality. That helps policymakers in itself, to have a clearer picture of what the main trends are, what the main issues are, and then you can have that policy discussion in a more informed way. So in the UN often, all our pieces, people say, what are the policy conclusions? What are the policy conclusions? I feel sometimes it's a little bit pretentious for me. I don't have the same inside knowledge of a PS or a minister who certainly know their portfolios much better than I would. But part of our job, I think, as an economist and as the economic policy research is just to present a clearer picture of actually what's going on the ground. And then that makes the job of the policymakers that much easier. Okay, so thank you very much again for the invitation, Seth, and
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. Another big round of applause, please, to Andrew for a nice presentation. I want to ask technician to show us the screen on the presentation to see if the screen of Mr. Muri is there, because we have a second presentation from Muri. We have the presentation on my laptop here. The presentation and the speaker is called, the presenter is, okay, that one. That's the next presentation. Now you can unmute Mr. Muri. He's in the Republic Democratic of Congo, but he's online. Mr. Muri, if you are with us, can you start immediately your presentation? Muri is Isidore Muri. Claude, let us know if he's muted. Unmuted, sorry. Oh, I think he's having technical issues. He's now not connected. So if so, we can maybe comment quickly on this presentation of, if you have like 3 questions to Andrew, then we break for tea, because he's not here, he's in Congo, but he's having technical issues, internet issues. He was connected, but the name on the Zoom, he just sent me a WhatsApp that he's called Isidore Muri. If you can't see someone called Isidore Muri, then he's not online. IT team, confirm if you can't see him. All right, for the interest of time, let us see if we have 3 questions to the presentation by Andrew, because we're supposed to comment on the 2 at once, on the 2 presentations. But if Isidore is not online, as they're trying to call him back, we can just ask a few questions. Let me see if you have people who want to comment on the presentation by Andrew. Yes, I start with DG Jonas, Director General from Ministry of Trade. Another one, I want to see 3 people want to comment. Okay, we have also Aris, CDA Oxfam. Another person, or the 2 only? All right, let us have those 2 comments, then we break for coffee, for the interest of time. Deji.
Thank you so much. I would appreciate EPRN for having successfully organized this conference. I think it's in our best interest as the Ministry of Trade and Industry to consider exploring further recommendations from this conference. And probably I have few comments or questions. And warrant from the presentation we have had from Andrew, I wanted to understand the positive side of the coin. Where have we seen, let's say, in the digital solutions, in the e-payment, what have we seen emerging as a new opportunities that have been brought by the COVID pandemic? And do we have some of the data or some of the facts to really confirm the positive effect of the COVID pandemic, so that also we have a clear idea on the policy recommendation that would support the promotion of these, I would say, emerging areas for consideration as we go for digital economy as well. That's one. Number two, I think the pandemic has clearly showed us how health and economics are interlinked. I think we haven't had enough experience in the past to confirm this, and at some extent you would see how, to some extent, economists and health experts were not really in touch on regular basis to align policies and making sure that there is convergence. I think there is a clear now correlation between health policies and economic policies, and was wondering to which extent now going forward there could be collaboration to strike the balance between economic policies as well as health policies. So what have we learned through this process, and what this could inform the future policies as we create this convergence? Because I'm saying this, you would, like the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Health, one would propose this on the benefit of the businesses, and the other one would propose another policy action on the benefit of health. And to some extent, they may seem conflicting, but to which extent can we create strike a balance between the two policies? And I think the pandemic has really created the need to consider these two areas and much more collaboration as we go forward. I don't know, through research, and maybe this could be a new, but I don't know to which extent the evidence-based research could inform the two policy convergence. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. Alice?
The impact of COVID on
Get closer to the microphone.
on different sectors. I would have loved to hear how differently the impact has affected different groups of people, particularly the difference between men and women, how it has affected them in order to devise strategies that are really inclusive in response or in recovery. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Andrew, you can react on this in 2 minutes quickly before we have another presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas, for the questions. So what are the positives? Yeah, you have to be careful how we frame the positives, because I mean that the economic impact has been very serious for a lot of people in terms of job losses as well as the health consequences. So yeah, it's definitely the case that a lot of people have been suffering through this pandemic. On the other hand, it also has changed perhaps the ways of doing business. It's accelerated a digital change that was happening anyway, but it's certainly accelerated it. So we see that in the Rwandan results, for example, in terms of the expansion of certain sectors, such as information and communications, public administration, yeah. And of course, Rwanda very boldly established a universal healthcare system. It has its deficiencies in terms of the amount of resources that's available, but it's the principle of having universal access to healthcare. And I think amongst the international community, suddenly when something like a pandemic hits, they realize that health consequences can be global and that everybody needs access to that. So you even find quite liberal magazines like The Economist, a couple of years before the pandemic actually, now arguing in favor of universal healthcare. And I think that's very positive, and I think Rwanda actually provides some lessons about how to implement that in the context of a low-income country. Alice, your question, yes. We'll have to work on that and the detail of the household surveys, you know, of how different groups have been more impacted. Certainly in particular subsectors, we see that people were dependent on those live-ins were badly hit. We also see the informal sector very badly hit. It started a debate about social protection measures. I think when you asked about, you know, the positives from the crisis, I would actually stress these two areas actually. The realization that you need universal access to good health care, and also about the need to strengthen social protection measures across the board. Because you can't leave segments of your society without any kind of social protection when you have a lockdown. No, that was discovered quickly by governments across the region. So I think those would be the two positives I would take home from this crisis, actually, more than anything. Plus the acceleration of digital ways of doing business, and yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we have now Mr. Muri, if you can summarize your presentation in 10 minutes. Muri, if you can hear us, you can start the presentation. I ask the IT team to share the screen. After Muri, we take coffee and then we resume. I think we are now going to use time rationally. Mr. Muri, if you can hear us, you can start. Muri, we are waiting for you. Yeah, I can see. Yes, good morning.
Thank you.
Can you get closer to your microphone of your computer?
I'm here to present our paper entitled Traversing Borders, Security and Vulnerability, the Society, Socio-Economic Impact of COVID-19. Informal my colleague, Mesa. Most of people involved in informal cross-border trade are generally women and are fast to poverty and vulnerability. The COVID-19 can increase their situation, which was already in. Women contribute largely in the survival of their households, and most of people involved in informal cross-border trade were found to be women. Despite the effort to remove the informality and to promote integration between the two countries, we still have the increase of informality in this sector. Some of the countries are found to limit the formalization of the sector. Among those we can now, for example, the harassment, the increase of unofficial taxation, we can find the corruption, etc. The objective of this paper is to explore the social vulnerability of small-scale economic actors involved in this sector, in the cross-border trade between the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Rwanda. We need to have a look on the condition of people who are involved in this sector, and deeply to have a look on how the COVID-19 has exacerbated their situation. The method we use to this paper was a mixed method, and we use two kinds of data in this paper. Firstly, it was the secondary data collected with the collaboration of FHL, which is the program depot, collected, as I said, in 2019, and it was focused on risk and vulnerability for people who are involved in informal cross-border trade. Another kind of data was the qualitative data. We made interviews to people in between September and October 2020 to see what was the impact of the COVID-19 on those people involved in this activity. What did we find? When you have a look on some figures, we found that about statistical data, generally, people who are involved in these activities are more likely not educated. At least they limited to secondary school, and as found by many other studies, mostly women are more involved in this activity than men. When you have a look at the access to credit, for example, you can see that most of people involved in this sector do not have access to credit. The reason is that because it is an informal activity. No one can give a loan to someone who is not formalized. That is the concern of this activity. What they do is to try to put together and to make some formal credit among them, and that allows them to finance themselves in their activities. Having a look before the COVID-19, we found that they have, on average, a limited amount of consumption. The consumption of people are involved in this small activity, it's very low compared to other activities. When we look at their income, we saw that their income is also low, and this brings them to fall under the line of poverty and to be subject to vulnerability. And that we made some calculation, and with the neuron curve, we found that those people are under the poverty line. We compare with the projection of the World Bank, which gives some indication to compare whether people are in poverty or not. We make a distinction between Rwandese and the Congolese, and what we found that is mostly there is a big difference between people who have a low income between Congolese and between Congolese groups. And when we compare the two groups, Congolese and Rwandese, we found that the difference in income is statistically significant, and that we can conclude that this activity do not allow people actually to attain the object. So, what was the constraint bring by the COVID-19? Firstly, we found that the COVID-19 significantly increased the price of products which are traded between the two countries. And with the lockdown, people do not cross the border, and that brings them to fall deeply in vulnerability. Make trade in groups, or if they are in informal sector, do not have possibility. So this brings our paper to suggest that to remove the impact of COVID-19, this sector needs to be actually formalized to help people to get loan, and this can be an alternative to limit also the problem of harassment, to transform the non-tariff barrier to become formalized. Also, we need to enforce a rigid policy which can allow these people to become self-care, and also to put measures which cannot just allow to close the lockdown, but just to see we can make these people together and bring them to move from the poverty. Thank you for listening. But I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Isidore. Okay. We will send the presentation so that we can maybe read after carefully. The internet with Mr. Isidore was not good, but I will share the presentation because he sent to me so that you can read after and be able to make comments. So let us just break for 10 minutes, take a cup of coffee, and then we come back with the 3 presentations. One from DDA, Minecofin, Mr. Austin Churu from UNDP, and then Aris from Oxfam. Those 3 presentations will be delivered together, and then we comment on them before we break for lunch. Now, can we take coffee and tea? Maximum 10 minutes. We come back in the session. Thank you very much. Colleagues online, colleagues who are following the conference through YouTube and Zoom, we're going to break for 10 minutes from now, counted from now. But IT team has some videos. We have a video from Oxfam, which they are going to display, and another video from RDB, which they will be disseminating during this break time, so that you won't be bored. But I'm sure you can also have some tea and coffee to take. Thank you. Enjoy.